mistakes in these slides. I'll try to point them out as I go along. I'm sorry. On Thursday, we talked about the basic theory of oligopoly, and today we're going to talk about sort of the biggest area to which this theory is applied, which is the control of mergers. So we'll start by talking about Cournot equilibrium and stability in Cournot equilibrium and the comparative statics of that, and how we can use that to think about the effects of entry by a new firm into the Cournot industry, and therefore how Cournot competition drives prices to cost. We'll then talk about more general ways in which competition may drive prices to cost, as well as empirical studies of the effect of competition on prices. We'll then talk about mergers in differentiated products industries and the concept of upward pricing pressure, as well as the legal and institutional basis of merger policy in the U.S. and around the world, and common policies that these agencies, common approaches that these agencies take to analyzing mergers, some of the challenges that merger policy faces going forward, as well as what things are currently left out of merger analysis that should be included. So recall that comparative statics go completely nuts if the equilibrium is not stable, right? So like an increase in supply would actually lead to a higher price if we weren't in a stable market equilibrium, right? So what is the appropriate notion of stability in Cournot competition? Well, remember that on Thursday we had these reaction functions, which were like how much does this firm want to do if the other firm does a little bit more, produces a little bit more. If they cross in the right direction, then things converge. So imagine that one firm increases its quantity by a small amount. How much, in the language of the reaction functions, where the quantity I produce is a function of the quantity the other firm produce, is Ri, how much, Edgar, would the production of firm I change when the production of firm J increases?
Wait, can you please describe the function that we're doing?
Okay, so we have this function Ri of 2j, which says how does firm I's production depend on how much firm J is producing, right?
Oh, because Qi is a function of Qj.
Exactly.
So it would just be the derivative of whatever that function is.
Exactly. So it's just Ri prime, right? So Ri prime is how much when Qj increases, Qi will increase. Okay. Now, how much does, so that's the first effect. So Qj rises, that affects Qi. But now that's going to have some follow-on effect on Qj, right? And Osama? Is Osama here? No? The effect that that's going to have on Qj, right, is again just Rj prime, right? So the total effect, so if you think, okay, Qj increases, that affects Qi, that in turn affects Qj, so you multiply those two things together and you get Ri prime times Rj prime, right? So when is this going to converge? When is this going to lead things to actually, slow down eventually? Botow? Botow, when is this process going to converge? So if Qj increases, that causes Qi to increase. That causes, Qj to increase by this amount. When is that process going to converge, or when is it going to blow up? Well, so if Qj increases by 1 unit on the first round and then changes by this much on the second round, under what conditions will that eventually decrease, and at what conditions will that blow up?
delta of a thought?
Yeah, Eric?
That's less than 1.
Yeah. So, yeah, so why is that? Well, if, it increases by twice what it increased by the last time, then it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger each round, right? And so that's going to cause things to blow up, right? Now, luckily, the second order conditions for a monopoly, just that the marginal revenue curve is decreasing relative to the marginal cost curve, is going to be enough to ensure this. So as long as we assume that the marginal cost, the derivative of marginal cost, is greater than the derivative of the industry marginal revenue curve, everything will be stable. And so you just have to make sure you check this whenever you're solving a problem. So otherwise you'll get very silly comparative statics, like this one firm increasing its production could cause the total industry production to go down. It's basically the same as in competitive equilibrium. So just to graph this, before we had a picture sort of like this. So if the product of the values is not less than 1, then if this is Qi, and this is Rj of Qi, and this is Ri of Qj, and this is Qj. So imagine we start at a particular Qi. We then figure out how much Qj that corresponds to. We then figure out how much Qi that corresponds to. This is nice. It's converging towards the thing. But if instead we had something where, say, we reverse the roles of these two things. So this was Ri of Qj, and this was Rj of Qi. So Ri of Qj, okay, so we would go from here to here, and then we would say, okay, how much Qi would that be? That would be here, and it would be like this, and it would go crazy off in that direction, and if we were above, it would go crazy off in the other direction. So this thing just corresponds, like in competitive equilibrium, to these things tracing a path back towards the equilibrium. Okay. So once, if one firm increases its production, this should always raise the total production of the industry. But exactly how much is it going to do that by, Edwin? Edwin Oliva? Well, it's going to increase it by the initial amount that the firm increased by, which is 1 unit, plus whatever the change in the other firm's production is, Ri prime, right? So it's going to be Ri prime plus 1. And this is the same, let's assume that the firms are symmetric, then this will be the same for the two firms. And this number is called the quantity pass-through rate, rho Q. The reason it's called the quantity pass-through rate is it's exactly equal to the pass-through rate, but I'm not going to, I talked about that in the turbo section, but I'm not going to talk about that here. So the stability condition is going to be the same as saying that the quantity pass-through rate is less than n over n minus 1. So what if there were what if there were 3 firms and one firm raised its production? What would happen? Well, the total increase in production, let's call that d capital Q dq tilde. That's going to be the amount by the third firm that's coming in. Well, each firm is going to have to increase its own production by 1/2 of the amount that the total industry changes minus 1, which is the direct increase by the new third firm, right? And that has to be consistent with the quantity pass-through rate. So the amount that the total industry's production changes when the new firm increases its production is the amount that all other firms increase their production times the pass-through rate of the last firm in the industry. So if we just think about one of the firms, there's a total amount that all the other firms are increasing their production, both from this outside firm and from the firm that's in the industry. So how much is that? That's 1 from the firm that's outside that's increasing its production, plus however much the other firm changes its production. And if we then distribute this through, we get 1 minus the quantity pass-through rate over 2 times d capital Q d Q tilde is equal to the pass-through rate over 2. And so we get that the amount that the industry increases when this third firm increases its production is the quantity pass-through rate over 2 minus the quantity pass-through rate. More generally, we can use the same logic to show that when there are n firms, the amount that the total industry production increases when some firm who's outside the industry comes in and produces something is the quantity pass-through rate over n minus 1 minus the quantity pass-through rate. So, the most important point is that this thing is always going to be positive whenever the stability condition is satisfied. And that means that if a new firm enters the industry, it will always raise its production, because initially the firm isn't in the industry. It's now entering the industry. That's raising its production from 0. And the impact that this has on total production is what, Michael? How much is this new firm increasing its production going to have on the total production of the industry? We just did it on the last slide.
It's like for 3 firms in the industry,
Or for any number of firms, right? Well, it's just what we derived in the last slide, right? If a new firm enters, and that's the n plus first firm, right? Then it's just going to increase the total production of the industry by this amount that we derive here, right? The point is that if the new firm is going to produce something, it must raise the total production of the industry by the amount we derived here. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the last line where you have the term n over n minus 1.
Yeah.
In the line before that, you have the number 2, but I don't see how that makes sense given that n is equal to 3 in that specific
No, so this is the number of firms before the new firm enters. So you could also make this n plus 1 over n if you want to think about the, Okay. So, this increased production will drive down prices because demand slopes downward, right? And thus the new firm is going to make the industry more competitive, right? And this is a more general feature. As firms increase, the industry becomes more competitive and we get towards perfect competition. So let's consider a specific example of this, which we used in class the other day: constant elasticity, demand, symmetric costs, and constant marginal price cost. So we know that each firm is going to set price plus quantity times the derivative of price equal to cost. Let's assume symmetry, so each firm is going to produce the total quantity of the industry over n. So we get this equation. And Broca, could you convert this expression into an elasticity? This one
you
here?
have P.
Yeah.
And then you have the 1 minus n elasticity, 1 over elasticity.
Yeah, exactly. So you have P times 1 minus 1 over n times the elasticity, right? Exactly. and that's equal to cost, and that gives us the Lerner formula that we had from before. And this is a general formula for Cournot competition. Okay, so if we have constant elasticity of demand, Patrick, what happens as n increases?
As n increases, it goes to 0.
Yeah, the markup is going to go to 0, right? Because as n increases, this elasticity is constant, and this markup just goes to 0. So the right-hand side, and thus the markup get driven to 0. As competition increases, price is driven to cost, and therefore the quantity is going to become the efficient quantity. So just to hammer home this point, let's consider another example. So imagine that demand is given by this form that you also looked at the problem set. So what is then going to be the equilibrium equation, Leo?
Yes.
Leo? What's going to be the, here is the equilibrium equation, what's that going to be in the case of linear demand? You can come drive it on the board if you want, or you want to come drive it on the board?
Sure.
So this was expressed in terms of price as a function of quantity. So why don't you solve for price as a function of quantity under this form first?
Drive first.
Yeah, so solve for price as a function of quantity first. Oh, but you have to, that's equal to quantity, right? So you have to put quantity on the other side. So you've got quantity is equal to this, right? So when you solve for the P, you need to include Q on this side of the equation. Right? Yeah. But then that doesn't multiply that. You're on the right track. Just make this little Q so it's not so cumbersome with the Q of P there. You can just make it a little letter Q. It's just quantity. Right? So quantity is equal to sigma minus sigma times P over 2 M's, right?
Right.
And then you can just solve for P in that equation. You've made a valiant effort. I'll let you off the hook, okay? So, right, we can just say if quantity is equal to this, right, we can multiply both sides by 2m, then we get Q times 2m is equal to sigma minus, 2m sigma minus sigma P. Divide by sigma, and we get this equation here. So P is equal to 2m times 1 minus Q over sigma. Then we take the derivative of price with respect to quantity, and we get negative 2m over sigma. And we know that the individual quantity of a firm is the total quantity divided by n. So we can then write out our equation from here, price plus quantity of an individual firm times quantity prime is equal to C, as 2m times 1 minus q over sigma, that's just p, times p prime, 2m over sigma times q over n is equal to C. So that's 2m times 1 minus n plus 1 q over n sigma is equal to C. And as n gets large, right, n plus 1 over n converges to 1, right? So the left-hand side of this equation converges to 2m times 1 minus q over sigma, which is exactly p. Right? And so that converges to price is equal to cost. So again, as the number of firms increase, price is driven down to cost. Okay, so these are both examples of a more general result called Cournot's theorem. So as the number of competing firms gets arbitrarily large, price converges to marginal cost. This is one of the most fundamental results in economics, probably the most fundamental result in industrial organization. It's both the foundation of everything that we were doing about perfect competition in the first half of the term, because this is why firms act as price takers. Why price is equal to marginal cost is that all firms are a small part of the industry. And it's the basis of most antitrust and competition policy, and it holds much more broadly than the examples above. Yeah,
I
Tejas.
just want to make sure, so
Yeah.
from the last part, is that given that the quantity of each firm is the same? Or from those particular?
Yeah, but the firms are all the same, so it's natural that they're all going to end up having the same quantity at equilibrium. So firms can have nonlinear costs, firms can be asymmetric, and you can have a broader range of demand functions than the ones we considered. And in fact, demand can satisfy weaker regularity conditions than we impose. The key is just that eventually every firm is a small part of the industry, and this fails only in sort of silly or perverse cases. But it's also broader than Cournot competition. So it's not just true in Cournot competition. Suppose that we have Bertrand competition, but the distribution of costs, but firms have different costs. This is something we briefly considered in the other class. This could represent Bertrand competition, or it could represent an auction, right? We said that there's a very close similarity between Bertrand competition, where people have different privately known costs, and an auction. And it's going to basically be optimal for firms to set their price to just beat their competitor. That is, they set it equal to their expectation of the costs of their competitor, their closest competitor, conditional on them winning and being the lowest cost firm. So I basically bid my best guess of the second highest bid. This is literally going to be right if the firms face perfectly inelastic demand, as in an auction. There's just going to be one object sold, and it is going to be, you're going to want to bid slightly lower price in order to increase the quantity that you're able to sell if the demand is somewhat elastic. So I'm not going to go through the proof, but it's sort of pretty intuitive that I'm going to try to just beat the next guy. If I'm allowed to name my price, I want to beat him, but I don't want to be much below him, because then that's going to lower the price that I get. Okay, so if this is what people are doing, if people are bidding just enough to beat the next lowest guy, what is going to happen as the number of competing firms gets large? Hisam?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as firms come in,
Yeah.
as it goes up, yes.
Don't look at the slide.
Uh,
Everyone's trying to just beat
so
the
yeah,
next guy.
basically, it's everything.
Yeah. Why? So there's a lot of firms now.
Yeah.
If I'm one firm what am I gonna, if there's lots of other people competing, what am I gonna have to bid if I'm gonna just try to beat the next guy? You're saying your cost? So why is that true?
The more it costs, like if I were to cost, I don't know, I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, does anyone else want to try to explain what happens? And Michael?
As the number of firms increases, like for the lowest cost out of it, you will probably have like a lower cost that's, there are just like two firms, and you're never gonna bid below your own cost.
Yeah.
So it drives it down to where
Yeah.
your cost is.
Yeah, that's right. So basically what happens is that as there get to be more firms, right? I think there's like tons of people breathing down my neck, right? So if I want to be the best, if I want to win, I'm going to have to do very close to the best I can possibly do, which is sort of intuitive. Like in any sort of competition you have, the more people that there are out there, the more likely it is that people are going to be doing very close to as well as the best person, right? And so nobody's going to have much margin for error, right? If you think about any athletic competition, the more people there are competing, the more that the top athlete has to give his absolute best performance, right? Because otherwise he'll be beaten by the next guy. Whereas if there's very few people, I can afford to slack off a little bit, and no one will beat me. Yeah, go ahead, Trent.
Wouldn't that run against, like your idea of Zipf's law?
Yeah, that's a good point. So that's an extremely good point. So in Zipf's law, that's not true, but the problem is that costs are bounded from below. So the point is that Zipf's law, you can be sort of like arbitrarily more talented than the next guy, right? Whereas as the number of people gets large, there's like sort of a bound from below of where costs can go, right? So costs can't keep getting lower and lower and lower arbitrarily, right? Yeah, Eric.
So if everyone's basically just trying to beat the price of like the next guy.
Yeah.
And so obviously if there's like a large number of firms, it basically just goes to the lowest price. I mean the
Yeah.
lowest cost. But if
Yeah.
there's like a small number of firms, wouldn't it go to the second lowest cost? Like because the lowest cost guy will sell at the second lowest cost to beat that guy.
Well, it's gonna always be exactly the lowest cost guy's expectation of the second lowest cost guy's firm. That's always that's exactly what this says here.
Right.
Right. So that's what it is when there aren't that many, but as it gets larger, that's gonna drive it down towards the lowest guy's cost. So my expectation of what the second lowest cost is gonna be, given that my cost is the lowest cost, is gonna get driven towards what my cost is, and my cost is gonna get driven towards the lowest possible. The winner's cost is gonna be driven towards the lowest possible cost. And thus price eventually converges to the lowest constant marginal cost. Intuitively, as there are more firms, each individual firm is less necessary to the whole. And so again, price is gonna get driven down to cost. Yeah, real quick.
Are you talking about in terms of long run? Because in the short run, if
Yeah.
it goes down, some firms will be out of business.
Yeah.
So supply will go down, prices go up.
Well, here the firms have constant marginal costs, so that's a very extreme case when, as prices come like down, all that happens is demand increases, right? Firms don't get driven out. It doesn't, yeah. So again, we obtain in a very different sort of a situation, sort of another version of Cournot's theorem. So as the number of firms increase, price gradually converges to the lowest constant marginal cost. If all costs were not constant marginal, then everyone would be doing different quantities, as Rokuk was suggesting. And this is going to become efficient too, because again, each firm is going to think that it can only just, go up against the next best firm. And as long as every firm is becoming a small part of the industry, that'll happen. So in a very different model, the same basic result applies. And so we can sort of take this away as a general rule about competition. First of all, eventually, but not immediately as the number of firms increases, competition drives prices to cost. And with enough firms, price should be close to efficient. Yeah,
Is
David.
this assuming that every firm has the same cost curve, or does it not matter?
No, they can be different, but the key thing needs to be that each firm becomes a small part of the industry as the number of firms increases. So it's not really that every firm's the same, but that as the number of firms increases, that every firm doesn't have such a Zipf's law type advantage, as Terrence was pointing out, that it remains
But the point is, they
large.
all eventually have to arrive at the same marginal cost, right? Because they're all providing the same price.
Well, then a lot of those firms are going
I-
to be driven out. The
Okay.
low firms are going to be driven out of the industry, and only the top ones will survive. So a natural question is how many firms is enough, right? So Bresnahan and Race did a very clever study of this. So they noticed that, as a market gets larger, it can support more firms, right? So in particular, imagine we have like a small town, right? If the small town is like 500 people, there might only be one dentist. But if it has like, 2,000 people, there might be 2 dentists. If it has 7,000 people, there might be 7 dentists or whatever, right? So let's say that the number of people required to support n firms is at capital S sub n, right? So if the town size at which there gets to be a 4th dentist is 5,000, then S sub n would be 5,000. And then let's call little s sub n the number of people per firm needed to support that many firms. So if again that was 5,000 and 4 dentists, then there would be 1,250 would be the number of people per dentist needed to support 4 dentists, right? Okay. So this represents the number of consumers per firm at different numbers of firms. And notice that if prices stayed constant as the number of firms increased, and the fixed cost of each firm was the same, then this little s sub n would be constant as the number of firms changed, right? So imagine that the town doubles in size, and everyone's still charging the same price. Well, you would think that there would be twice as many dentists, right? Because twice as many dentists, they would all have the same number of customers, right? And that would be just enough to support the thing. So we can take it potentially as an indication that prices are falling as the number of firms increase if more customers are required to support a second dentist than were required to support the first dentist. And if there were more customers required to support the third dentist than were required to support the second dentist, again, that indicates prices would be falling. So that would be the same as the S sub 3 being smaller. Sorry, this should be reversed. S sub 3 should be greater than S sub 2, and S sub 2 should be greater than S sub 1. Another reason that this could happen is that imagine that the first dentist who comes in is the dentist who can enter most cheaply, and then the next dentist, it's more expensive for him to enter, and so forth. That would lead to the same pattern. But let's just interpret it that way for now. It's sort of a nice, simple way to think about what might be going on. So what Bresnahan and Race did is they found 5 professions and a bunch of rural towns, and they found out how many people lived in each town and how many dentists or mechanics or whatever there was in each town. And then they looked for the level at which S started to level out rather than continuing to rise, because this indicates the point at which we've sort of reached the as low as prices are going to get. And they found that this was around 3 to 5 professionals. So here's the graph that they did. This one is for druggists. The triangles for druggists. The diamonds are for tire dealers. The circles are for doctors. The squares are for dentists. And the crosses are for plumbers. And this shows the ratio of the number of people needed to support 5 firms to the number of people needed to support 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 firms. And you see this sort of comes down rapidly as you get towards 3 firms. The biggest difference is when you move from 1 to 2, and then there's a somewhat smaller difference from 2 to 3, but then very little happens from 3 firms on, right? So what that indicates is that sort of 3 or 4 firms seems to be, in these industries at least, enough for the industry to be very competitive. Okay. So, so far what we've assumed is that all the competing firms had exactly the same product. But in the real world, much competition comes from firms that have different products, right? That are imperfect substitutes for one another. And now I want to think about what does the competition or the removal of competition do to prices in that type of an industry? Well, that's a little bit tricky because the question is, what do we even mean by competition here, right? Because in a differentiated product industry, a new firm coming into the industry doesn't just compete, it brings a whole new product. So that changes things in a way that's different than just removing competition or creating it. So the simplest way to think about it is if we take an industry and we take two firms that merge with one another, that's sort of removing competition without changing the products that are offered. And how does that affect prices? Two things that were separately owned, Burger King and McDonald's, now are owned by one company. And so even though they're still offering Burger King and McDonald's, they're owned by the same company. So let's consider sort of the simplest model of this situation. Imagine that each firm has a linear demand function. Their quantity depends linearly on their price and the quantity of the other firms. So imagine that they have a common constant marginal cost, and let's assume that the price decreases more quickly in their own price than it increases in the price of their rival, right? What is going to be the optimal price for each firm? Well, we can just do quantity times price minus cost, take the derivative of that, and what we get is that price minus cost is equal to quantity over the derivative of quantity with respect to price, right? That's the equation that we've done many times in class. The markup is equal to quantity over the negative of the derivative of quantity with respect to price. And so that gives us alpha minus beta pi plus gamma pj over beta. And then we can simplify this right-hand side to be alpha plus gamma pj over beta minus pi, right? Because the betas divide through here. And then if we bring that to the other side of the equation, we get that pi times 2 is equal to c plus this. If we then multiply c by beta and divide through and make a common denominator, then divide through by 2, we get this equation. The price is equal to beta c plus alpha plus gamma pj over 2 beta. Do people want me to go through and do the algebra there? Would people like to see that? Raise your hand if you would like to see that. Okay, people want to see the algebra. Okay. Okay, so we got that pi minus c is equal to q over negative q prime, right? And q is just that expression, and q prime is beta, right? Because the derivative with respect to pi is negative beta, so negative q prime is beta. So this is equal to alpha minus beta pi plus gamma pj over beta. Okay, so that, dividing through by beta on the pi, is alpha plus gamma pj over beta is equal to pi. Sorry, minus pi. Okay, so now we can bring this pi to the other side of the equation and put the c on this side. So we get 2 pi is equal to c plus gamma plus gamma pj, alpha plus gamma pj over beta. So now we can make a common denominator with c, and that's going to be c plus alpha plus gamma pj over beta. Right? Divide both sides by 2, and we have the equation that we directed here. Okay. So then by symmetry, the two prices are going to be equal to one another in equilibrium. So we can take this pj and say that it's going to be the same as pi. Bring it over to this side. So we get 1 minus gamma over 2 beta times p is equal to this. And that gives us this final equation that the pre-merger price is equal to beta times c plus alpha over 2 beta minus gamma. Okay. By the way, just so you guys know, the reason I do algebra in these things is not because it's important that you master this particular algebra. The reason that I do algebra is because I got strong demands from you guys that you want to see me go through various algebra things. So this is not like absolutely crucial that you master this particular derivation. The point is I'm just trying to show you the sorts of like algebra things that you might do on homework, just so you get a sense for some algebra. But it's not like you have to absolutely master this particular algebra. That's not the point. The point is to get a sense for like doing some examples of the sorts of things that you might do on. Okay. So after the merger, by symmetry, the firms can basically treat the two products as if they were just one product, right? So now that product is going to have demand, which is 2 because there's the two products, times alpha minus beta minus gamma times p. Why is that? Because the two prices, they're treating the two products as if they're the same product, and so they're just going to charge one common price for the two things. And if you just plug in the same common price into this equation, you get minus beta minus alpha, gamma. And so the optimal place to price on this demand curve the optimal place to price on this demand curve is just halfway up it, right? This is just the monopoly problem that we were doing. What's the point at which there's no demand? Well, it's alpha over beta minus gamma. Halfway up that is 1/2 alpha over beta minus gamma. Plus 1/2 of the cost, right? Because the pass-through rate of cost is 1/2. And so that gives us beta minus gamma times c plus alpha over 2 beta minus gamma. So what's the difference between these two things? Well, I don't expect you to be able to do it in your head, and I don't want to go through more just manipulation. So if you just plug this into Mathematica, we get the following expression. 1/2, the change in prices is 1/2 times gamma over beta minus gamma times alpha minus beta minus gamma c over 2 beta minus gamma. Okay, what the heck is that? There are basically 3 crucial factors here. The first one is the intensity or the closeness of competition between the two firms. This is gamma over beta minus gamma. And Edward? Yeah. Why is gamma over beta minus gamma the intensity or closeness of competition?
Isn't just the rate that the prices change when quantity changes?
Yes, but in particular, why this number in particular? Why is this measuring the extent to which we're closely competing with one another? What would happen, for example, if gamma was equal to 0?
0.
Yeah, this would be 0, and what does gamma denote?
The amount that the competitor changes the price.
exactly, when the competitor changes its price, how much does that increase the demand for my product? That's sort of the extent to which we're competing with one another, right? So this is a measure of the intensity or closeness of competition between the two firms. This thing is just the pre-merger markup. So why is this thing the pre-merger markup? Joshua? Why is this thing the pre-merger markup? We have the pre-merger price up here. Pre-merger markup is pre-merger price minus cost, right? So why is this quantity here the pre-merger markup? Well, here's the pre-merger price. If we subtract cost off from that, right? So the pre-merger price is beta C plus alpha over 2 beta minus gamma, right? And if we subtract cost from that, that's exactly alpha minus beta minus gamma times cost over 2 beta minus gamma. Right? So this thing is exactly the pre-merger markup. And 1/2, what's that? That's the pass-through rate under linear demand, which we studied. So prices increase by 1/2 times this measure of the intensity of competition times the pass-through rate. The markup times the pass-through rate times the intensity of competition. Okay. So that was an example so that we could go through the relevant algebra. But it's actually pretty intuitive why these are the factors that show up, and they show up much more broadly. So let's focus on the first two ones for the moment. The intensity of competition and the markup. So let's imagine that Burger King and McDonald's were going to merge with one another, right? So why would this lead Burger King to raise its prices? Well, Connie, why would, just intuitively, would Burger King have an incentive to raise its prices if it merged with McDonald's?
Because the people who like McDonald's will go to Burger King burgers, and that increases demand for burgers and Burger King sells it.
Yeah, so if they reduce their price, if they increase their price, then that will lead Burger King to sell more burgers, right? Yeah. And that will benefit the joint company, right? Okay, so every time Burger King sells a burger and satisfies a customer, that means that there's one person who's no longer going to consider buying a burger at McDonald's, right? And let's call that fraction of people who, if they didn't buy a Burger King burger, would buy one at McDonald's, D sub BK to MD. That's called the diversion ratio between Burger King and McDonald's. It's what fraction of the customers who buy a McDonald's burger would have buy Burger King burger would otherwise have bought a McDonald's burger. This causes McDonald's, as a result of not having sold that burger, to lose the marginal profit it would have earned on that burger, which is the markup that it would have earned on that burger, right? M sub MD. Now, once the companies merge, that counts as a loss to Burger King as well, right? Because Burger King now owns McDonald's. So if it, if it loses profits on its McDonald's unit, that's losing profits overall. So this means that there's a new opportunity cost of making a sale, which is created by the merger. So D sub BK to MD times MMD is now, what I was trying to say here, this should sort of be separated, is that M sub MD is equal to the markup, the difference between price and cost for McDonald's, And then the product of these two things is the total amount of loss to Burger King of selling a burger. It loses some number of sales of McDonald's burgers, and what that costs it is the markup that it would have earned on those burgers. And this quantity on the left-hand side here is called the upward pricing pressure on Burger King created by the merger with McDonald's. And notice that this is exactly the two factors in our linear analysis, right? This was the markup, and this was the diversion ratio, because this was how much this was the ratio of how much the other guy's sales increased to how much my sales declined. Okay, so upward pricing pressure is the diversion ratio times the markup. Okay, so the UPP is the opportunity cost that's created by a merger. But how exactly does this translate into prices? Well, as we know, if firms have higher costs, they're going to tend to charge higher prices. And David, at what rate does an increase in cost change into an increase in prices? What do we call that?
Well, we call that the pass-through rate.
That's the pass-through rate. Yep, that's exactly right. So therefore, if you multiply the UPP by the pass-through rate, that will tell you how much the prices change as a result of the merger. So this is a little bit subtle because both of the firms' prices are changing at the same time. But this is exactly the reason why we got a 1/2 showing up here, right? Because that's the pass-through rate for linear demand. Okay, so now if we want to get the impact that has on consumer welfare, how do we do that, Udo? How do we convert a change in prices into a change in consumer welfare?
Price times quantity.
Yeah, exactly, the change in price times quantity, right? Because the quantity that is sold is the effect of a change in price on consumer welfare, right? And this gives us a relatively simple methodology for predicting the effects of a merger. In order to make a prediction, one needs to measure the diversion ratio, the markup, and the quantity, and the pass-through. If one can measure those four things, one can predict how much consumer welfare is affected by the merger. And you can do this using internal documents from a company, or studies of like which companies won which contracts and who were their closest competitors. You can do it using surveys of consumers and what products they would have purchased if they didn't purchase this one. Or using internet data, like if you go on Amazon, it says people who are interested in this product were also interested in that product. So that gives you a sense that people who might have bought this would, if they hadn't bought that, probably have bought this other product. You can also use econometrics and demand estimation. You can, for example, look at times where firms' costs changed and see what effect that had on the demand in the market by changing their prices. Okay, so in the United States, control over mergers like this comes from the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was the second Antitrust Act. So the first one, which we talked about on Thursday, was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made it illegal to form a cartel. But if it's illegal to form a cartel, why not just buy up your competitor, right? So then they had to pass a second law, which made it illegal to merge legally with firms, or tried to limit them. So why, Suraj, did they not just decide in the Clayton Act to make all mergers illegal? If our analysis says that mergers are going to raise prices, which it does, why wouldn't they just make all horizontal mergers illegal?
Because sometimes the market's best served by a natural monopoly, in which case you have one person can efficiently decrease costs and increase output.
Yeah, so if there's economies of scale, or if there's just one firm that's incompetent and another firm that's really competent, it makes a lot more sense for the competent firm to take over the incompetent firm, right? So one example of this is a big debate over the AT&T merger with T-Mobile right now, is that people think it's going to reduce competition, but on the other hand, I think a lot of people of AT&T are sort of excited about the idea that AT&T's crappy network coverage will get a lot better when they also include all the T-Mobile stop stations, right? And so there's agencies in the United States that have to weigh the anti-competitive effects against the benefits coming from the economies of scale. And there are several agencies in the United States that share the responsibility for this, but there are two primary ones which share responsibility by industry. So these two agencies divide up different industries. Some have responsibility for one set of industries, some have responsibility for the other. And Maria, what are the two agencies in the United States that have responsibility?
The Trade Commission, right? And
The Federal Trade Commission.
Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division.
Of the Department of Justice. Exactly right. The Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, the Federal Trade Commission, and companies have to notify these agencies before they want to merge. Yeah, Matt.
Which industries does each one cover?
Oh, God. I know like some particular examples. So for example, all the banking stuff is DOJ. All telecommunications is DOJ. Cement is FTC. Newspapers are FTC. It's like, you'd have to spend hours memorizing this because it's like very disaggregated.
Why,
Which one? Yeah,
why
what?
split it up? Wouldn't you have economies of scale by combining this department?
A lot of people think so. It's sort of a historical accident. So basically what happened is the FTC was created under Roosevelt, and Roosevelt wanted to cartelize a bunch of industries. He didn't want to have competition. So he gave the FTC responsibility for the industries he wanted to cartelize, and the DOJ kept responsibility for the other ones. And yes, that's basically what happened. But anyway, and there's actually quite a lot of bureaucratic fighting, as you might imagine, over whether some things. So like for example, imagine the DOJ has responsibility for like fast food, and the FTC has responsibility for like consumer products, and then you have companies that do both of those things. Then there's like all this fight over like which agency gets responsibility for a given merger. So it's actually kind of stupid, but. Sometimes the agencies have directors who get along really well with one another, and that helps solve the problem. So the agencies basically subpoena data from these companies that are trying to merge in two stages. So the first stage is that they just have to notify them that they're merging and give like the basic information that they release to the public. Then the agencies filter out about 90% of all mergers that way and say those are all fine. Then there's about 10% they say this might be a problem. And so they say, please give us some more detailed information. And then they have 1 month to review that and decide whether they want more information. So if after a month they're really concerned, then they ask, give us everything you've got. You have to go do survey. You have to do all this stuff. And then they have 3 months on the basis of that to decide whether to block the merger or not. And they have a team between the two of them, about 150 PhD economists who do all this analysis, and a bunch of interns like you guys if you ever want to go work for a summer at the DOJ or the FTC. Almost all the mergers survive without getting challenged. The overwhelming majority of those that the DOJ is uncomfortable with, it finds some settlement with the parties, says either, look, it's not worth it, just give up and trying to merge, we don't like it, or they say, well, look, we'll let you merge, but you have to like divest the following parts of your company that might be in conflict and might cause problems. And then in a very few cases, and this is what happened with AT&T and T-Mobile, it goes to court. And they fight it out. So the US regulation of antitrust with 150 PhD economists is probably the most sophisticated single infrastructure for the regulation of the economy in the world. And it's been copied by many developed countries. So for example, the European Commission is basically, the way they deal with this stuff is based around how it works in the US. other Commonwealth countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And it also exists to some extent and unevenly and in a less structured form in the developing world. So in many developing countries, there's actually no law against mergers, and this includes Peru, where I've been working on trying to write a law against mergers. In other countries, there is a law, but there's basically no infrastructure to enforce it, so it's only on paper. In other countries, there is some infrastructure, but there's very, very little involvement of economists or economics in it. It's basically done by lawyers or on a political basis. And a few countries have sort of tried to implement a more sophisticated infrastructure. So China, Brazil, and Chile are three good examples of that have come quite a ways. But it's very heterogeneous across the world. And while most of the field of industrial organization that I work in focuses on trying to figure out very minute details of various types of contracts that people might do in the US, one of the really big issues is just that many countries in the world really have no infrastructure for dealing with this stuff. And there's basically, cartels running around buying up whoever they want. So I think, one really important agenda item is just bringing basic competition policy to developing countries. Okay, so the traditional way that these agencies evaluated whether a merger should be allowed or not was based on so-called industry concentration. And they, and the way that they tried to think about industry concentration is that they wanted to treat an entire industry as a single product. They want to sort of act as if there's just one market for the products of all the relevant firms. And is Justin here? Yeah, Justin. How did they try? How does the process? What's the process they go through for thinking which firms are in the industry?
One of them is a couple different factors. One of them is geographic, like cost of transportation to bring products to different consumers.
Have a very particular algorithm that they go through. So what they do is they start with the two products that are merging, and then they gradually add into the market the products that are closest substitutes for those products. And that's based on the two factors that you said, which products are close to one another physically, and which are sort of close in product space, which are sort of similar. So for example, if there were different supermarkets merging, you'd want to, and they were both in California, you wouldn't want to add supermarkets that only operate on the East Coast. But you also wouldn't want to add into the market for two super premium grocery stores like Walmart or something like that, because that probably doesn't compete that heavily with a super premium store. And they call something a market when they reach the point where someone who owned all of the products in that group would, if they had a monopoly over all those, have an incentive to increase the prices by a small but significant and non-transitory amount. That is usually interpreted as about 5% at least for at least 1 year. Yeah?
Is it the hypothetical monopoly test?
This is called the hypothetical monopoly test. They say if someone were to have a monopoly over this market, then they would have an incentive to introduce a small but significant and non-transitory increase in price, or 5% for 1 year. Then they seek within that industry is thus defined to measure how concentrated the industry is. And does anyone remember how they measured concentration within the industry? Yeah.
Well, they first,
What's your name again? Chen. Yeah.
They first measure the number of significant competitors in the market.
Yeah.
The second one is to measure the HHI, where it's like this summing up the scales of the individual market share.
That's absolutely right. So that's exactly what they do.
And for the HHI, they want to measure two things. The first one is the post-merger level of HHI, HHI is
That's exactly right. So there's this thing called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. And what is that? Well, let's let the firm's share of the industry, little qi over capital Q, be sigma I. Then the HHI is the sum of the squares of the firm's share in the industry. And sometimes you multiply this not by 1,000, but by 10,000. Sorry, there's a mistake there. Now, 1 over H is the approximate number of firms in the industry. Why is that? Imagine that there were 5 firms and they all had the same 1/5 of the industry's production, and this would be the sum of 1/5 squared, right? Which is 5 times the sum of 1/5 squared, which is 1/5, right? So this is sort of a quantity-weighted index of what fraction of the industry everyone has. And so, you know, if the HHI is around 2,000, that says that there's roughly 5 firms in the industry. If it's around, 3,300, there's roughly 3 firms in the industry, and so forth. And from Bresnahan and Race's analysis, it suggests that we should start being worried if we start getting down to around 3 to 5 firms in the industry. You can also relate so that's one reason why we might think that HHI is useful. Another reason is Stigler found a way to relate it to the possibilities for collusion. And it's also somewhat related to the Cournot model. So remember that in the Cournot model, price minus cost is equal to derivative of price times quantity. If we multiply this by capital Q and then divide this by capital Q, you get that that becomes the price over the elasticity, and then that's multiplied by the share. And so if we then sum across all the firms in the industry, multiplied by their markup, then we find that the share-weighted markup in the industry, so sort of like the average markup that consumers pay, is equal to the Herfindahl index divided by the elasticity. So it sort of gives a measure of the markups that consumers pay. And what they usually do is they look whether H is greater than 1,800 after the merger. So if there's like roughly going to be less than 5 firms after the merger, and or the merger causes the HHI to rise by 300, in which case they view the merger as potentially problematic. Unfortunately, this is kind of a nice little standard, but it's proved very cumbersome to apply in the real world. And the reason is that it requires every product either be like exactly the same as all the products in the industry, or totally different. And that's a little bit silly. So there was a merger between Wild Oats and Whole Foods a couple of years ago. And the question that the whole thing was the debate over whether the market was the market for luxury organic groceries or the market for all groceries. And the answer is, well, it's true other grocery stores do compete with Whole Foods and Wild Oats a bit. But it's like, it's not like either all grocery stores are the same, or even that Wild Oats and Whole Foods are the same. And they're all different. They're all competing with each other to different extents. And like either putting every store either being exactly the same or being completely outside is sort of a silly way to approach it, right? What really matters is these like diversion ratio things that we were talking about before, right? And second, the relevance of industry concentration is a bit unclear. Because for example, in a Cournot industry, concentration will rise most in cases where there's a really efficient firm that's taking over a really inefficient firm, and that's exactly the beneficial case. So it's not at all clear that that's the right way to think about things. So that's the merger guidelines, which are guidelines issued by the agencies, which I had you guys read, and represent sort of the official policy about how they're going to evaluate mergers and how firms can think about how they're going to approach mergers, has been moving away from just looking at this. So these guidelines are issued about every 10 years since 1980. And until the most recent guidelines, they were focused on this market definition and concentration idea. But there was recently a revision which I was involved with, and there was also a similar revision in the United Kingdom and in Europe. And the new ones are based on this notion of upward pricing pressure that we talked about a few slides back. They explicitly talk about diversion ratios and markups. They were designed by Carl Shapiro and Joe Farrell, who are two Berkeley professors, who were respectively the chief economists at the DOJ and the FTC, and were the original creators of the idea of UPP. And progress along these dimensions is still ongoing, and new future guidelines may reflect some of the ideas that we talked about earlier. For example, the United Kingdom just commissioned a report on how to incorporate conjectural variations into UPP and so forth. Okay. But there's a number, I think, of pretty key considerations which show up in the merger guidelines, which we didn't discuss today. So one of those is efficiencies, right? The reason that you don't just block all mergers is that there may be, economies of scale, and this is the main offsetting force. We didn't talk about how to quantify that at all today, but you can imagine that it's, there's some direct benefits in terms of reducing fixed costs. There's also a benefit of reducing marginal costs that will reduce prices because of pass-through. There's entry of new firms into the industry, right? So if firms try to raise prices after they merge, other firms might enter into the industry to compete with them. And that can reduce their ability to raise prices. They might change things other than prices, right? They might change quality or the product range, and that can have Spence effects and all the sorts of effects that you explored on the problem set and that we talked about in class a couple weeks ago. And these might either exacerbate the effects because the Spence distortion gets worse, or in some cases it might make things better because of, say, adverse selection. I might be charging, when we're competing, too high of a price because I don't want to get your really sick patients. When we merge, I could actually reduce my price potentially because of that. There are effects on innovation, potentially. So it may change firms' incentives to invest in research and development. Also, firms may merge because the people who are buying from them have a monopsony, and their merger may give them more power to offset that monopsony, and that might be a benefit of the merger. Okay. And finally, those things all show up in the merger guidelines, but as usual, some of the most interesting issues, I think, are the ones that don't even show up. So for example, pass-through, even though we saw that it played an important role, doesn't show up at all in the merger guidelines. Another thing is that, usually the way that merger disputes get resolved is not that you just block the entire merger, it's that you settle and you require them to sort of divest some part of their business. And, figuring out which things should be divested, figuring out what the effects of different interventions would be, requires a specific analysis of that intervention, and that's not included anywhere in the merger guidelines. Similarly, we talked a lot in the intellectual property lecture about the effect that monopoly power has on which firms want to create what products, which firms want to enter the industry. And we didn't talk about that at all here, right? We only talked about the effects that it directly had on prices. But allowing firms or not allowing them to merge creates different profits, and that can incentivize different firms to enter the industry. So that's an important part of merger policy. And that's something that I'm working on with Jean Tirole, but it doesn't show up at all in the merger guidelines. Another big issue is that firms might merge just so that they could get too big to fail, so that the government would have to bail them out if they get into trouble, right? And that's not really considered in the merger guidelines anywhere either. And in fact, that was a big driver, I think, of the giant wave of bank consolidations over the last 20 years, which the government didn't do anything to control because it wasn't included in the standard way of thinking about merger policy, because they weren't thinking about too big to fail. Another, this may help firms achieve bailouts from the government, but it's not necessarily in the public interest, right? And finally, mergers can give firms more political power, and that's what you're going to explore on the problem set. So again, all of these things are great possibilities for BA theses. We'll have our last class a week from today, and you can turn in your problem set then. So have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everybody.